Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorinquiry, my interview series on my side channel here. And my guest for this one is going to be William M. Briggs, who is an individual who has a background in statistics. He also writes a lot of very, I would say, interesting, thought-provoking articles. He has a book that I will certainly lead into and talk about called Everything You Believe Is Wrong. And the title is very specific there. Don't get it twisted. So I would actually start by asking you this initial question, William, which is when I've read a lot of your work, one thing I really enjoy about it is I find it very thought-provoking, actually. It actually challenges a lot of things like core beliefs. So I would say even my framework of how I think about how you arrive at opinions or conclusions, etc. So I thought a question I would ask you to kind of rewind that whole topic to the absolute beginning is, do you think people have an innate intuitive sense of what's right or what's true or a sense to them? Or is it the case that, I don't know, society or modern schooling drives that out of you or pigeonholes you? Or is there an element of, to have like reason and logic and these things and to spot fallacy, is there a didactic element that's necessary? What do you think?
Absolutely. Great question. Yes. Yes and no. Everybody has got some element of this, but some people have more than others. Some people are better at intuiting obvious truths, grasping universals, necessary truths and the like, and making logical arguments. To an extent, yes, of course, training can help you hone these skills, but not everybody has them. That's an absolute fact. Some people are easily fooled by very simple arguments. That's what that book is about. Try to get people to recognize the very simple arguments that I think are the most common arguments used to fool people. But not everybody gets it just the same. I mean, there are some elementary truths that everybody gets and are inescapable. I mean, like Descartes and before him, others have shown. I mean, we know we exist. Everybody could know that. It doesn't require any special training to reason that you exist. I mean, so elementary truths, there's lots of them people can know. More complex ones require more innate abilities. And yes, training can in fact help to a point. I mean, there is a point. The opposite side of this is that, can we know what we cannot know? And the answer to that is no.
Sure.
For instance, like IQ tests, for instance, these things are rough gauges of a certain form of intelligence. They certainly are useful. I don't discourage people from using them. They have their uses. They are informative up to an extent. But take the smartest guy in the world, the smartest guy ever, and he's going to create an IQ test to test for knowledge, ability. All right. So we got the smartest guy ever. He's making this test. Now he can make a test to see if anybody is as smart as he is and gauge that in some way or another, roughly quantify it. But he cannot ask questions to which he cannot figure out the answers to, or even know what kinds of reasoning are required for questions he can't know. So there's a fundamental limitation to these kinds of things, and that none of us know what it is. I don't know what it is for the very reason I just stated. So yeah, there are limitations to that on both directions.
Because one thing I would say to bridge off of that is, in my own field, where I'm a journalist within a sporting field, let's just say, one thing I've actually found has been incredibly instructive on my thinking was learning things like professional journalistic ethics. I'll give you a brief example. There was a player in one of the games I covered where, from the eye test, I suspect he cheated, actually. He maybe used some software and was able to sort of like get basically better results than he should have done. But I never, ever had any evidence. And so one thing I learned, and this many people in my field went awry on topics like this, was I will never say professionally in my work he cheated, because I cannot know that, and I will never have the evidence for that. So I would always say I think he cheated, which to someone who's a layman might seem like the same thing, but I'm sure you can see the distinction is actually very key there. So yeah, basically what I would say is things like that have become almost like signposts to head in a direction, or sometimes guardrails to stop me sort of falling off the cliff, as it were. And I would say, actually, even though it seemed like I just did it in my professional field, I then found when I would go into areas outside of my field, just life in general, relationships, history, what do I believe in? I found also having sort of protocols like that was very, very useful. So I wanted to ask, in your case, how much of these things, I mean, I notice in your case, you're an older guy. You're someone where it's very easy to see the finished product and think, right, the person was always like that. And as I'm kind of point out in my case, I wasn't like this at all. Like if I was 18, I didn't know any of these things. I would have had some very wild, emotional, just, seat of my pant opinions. So how much of this kind of came to you, has always been in you? How much have you sort of intentionally built the scaffolding over the top, as it were?
That's a very good question too. But before I get to that, can I give a rousing agreement to what you just said about the gaming thing? Because I started off my interest. This is part of answering it in two ways, both questions at the same time. I started off with an interest in amateur magic, and what I was interested in is not the geeky illusion kind of thing, sawing a woman in half, but I'm very much interested in mentalism. Which is the ability to fool people into thinking you could read their minds, that you have extra sensory abilities, or there's something beyond in which it doesn't seem like a trick is happening.
Sure.
There's no cards or anything like this, and so forth. So there are all sorts of people. This is a huge thing. Just back in the 1970s, I was a boy. And psychic phenomena was taken very seriously. It was written up in the big science journals of the day, Science Magazine in the United States and so forth. And it was a very, very serious thing. And there were people, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's kind of on the downswing now, a guy named Uri Geller.
Oh, of course, yeah. I used to be into counterculture stuff, so yes.
Exactly. So he used to say, well, he could bend keys with his mind.
Yes.
He'd pick up a key and he'd rub the key and talk softly to it and woo the key, and the key would melt under his loving gaze and things like this. Well, no one ever caught him cheating, but there were many people who were able to demonstrate I could do the same feat by these kind of magic tricks. I could read your mind, pretend to read your mind by these same kind. I could reproduce his effects using these magical tricks. All right. Okay. So that's not to say that you've proved he's cheating.
Sure.
Because nobody caught him in the act. But I could show that there's an alternate way of doing things. But that's not conclusive.
Yes.
That's absolutely, and you can go the opposite way with that too.
But it's easy to conflate though, right? I imagine a lot of people do just jump to that conclusion, right?
They do. But the problem is when you're considering miracles, for instance, do miracles occur? Well, a lot of people dismiss the idea of miracles in just the same way. They say, look, all right, how did Jesus turn the water into wine? Okay, I don't know, but maybe, okay, I know what happened. The servants actually got together and they were embarrassed, and what they really did was they broke out the good wine and served it up and pretended that the water had changed into wine. Okay, that's an alternate explanation, for which there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But because you have produced this alternate explanation, people take that as proof then that the miracle is false. So this alternate explanation stuff is never finally proof and can't be for just those reasons. So your journalistic ethics you've honed them to a fine logical point. You can't get any better than that. And so my own self, I mean, I was always a pain in the ass in this kind of a way. I mean, no one likes these kind of people like myself who are correcting them. I don't make a habit of this. I don't do it in public or in person or anything like this, but I do it in writing because I don't like being fooled by the powers that be, by experts and by people who should know better and the like. So I had this, and I had a kind of my father was kind of a blue collar guy, and I didn't realize that I started off in the military. I was just a regular grunt. I was doing cryptographic stuff. They tested me and put me in this cryptographic stuff so I could do that kind of math. And then I started reading on my own, and I realized, I could do this stuff. I could handle this math. I could do all this kind of stuff, which I just sort of doubted because it wasn't a tradition in my family. And then I went off and did it. And so there you are.
One thing I would ask is when people think about the topic of being educated. There's that famous line people will use, ironically, for universities, even though they are somewhat antithetical to this now, which is, you don't want to be taught what to think, you need to be taught how to think. And as I say, that idea maybe is a beautiful, grand idea, a romantic idea of what a university should be, but there are often, I would say academia is somewhat plagued by the latter now. It's a lot of, instructive, like just think this, you're a good person if you think this, everyone now thinks this, it's the progressive thing to think this. And one thing I really enjoyed about your book that we were talking about, the Everything You Believe is Wrong, is even the way you frame it as, it's not that everything you know is wrong. There's a very key distinction there, but everything you believe is wrong because your belief is shaped by like fallacious thinking, things like what culturally you're told to believe, other things like that. So one thing I would ask is this, on that topic of like how to think, not what to think, and I also noticed you make kind of the distinction there between belief and knowing. What would you say about this? What's so key about this aspect? Because I feel like a lot of people in the modern day, I did this myself in many areas. Oftentimes, someone I've noticed you've lampooned a number of times, Christopher Hitchens. I'll admit, when I was 20, I watched probably every video on the internet of Christopher Hitchens. And I used to do that thing where I thought, this guy's really smart. He's making a lot of good points. And so I would naturally get caught up in the current of other things he was saying, which I have to admit, you made some great points. When I go back now, 20 years later, some of those debates he did, holy moly, they don't hold up, mate. Like he's just using cheeky debate tactics all over the place. He's never answering what the person says. He's using charisma and charm to rizzle-dizzle his way out of it. And I was kind of shocked. So on this topic, like how to think, not what to think, and the difference between belief and knowing, what would you say?
Hitchens in particular. Yeah, his favorite was the great bluster, the bluster fallacy, I'd call it. Just to gruff and how dare you even suggest such a thing to me? and by his physical intimidation, cow somebody into conceding a point, which of course is farcical. So almost everybody has to be taught what to think before they can be taught how to think. If you don't have the tools, the fundamental knowledge to start with, even if you're good at thinking, you will create for yourself intricate fallacies. Right. And the smarter you are, the smarter and better you are, rather, at this, the more facility you have with thinking. If you start off with all these false beliefs, false premises, you can concoct for yourself, a magnificent theory that's absolutely, totally wrong, but difficult to prove wrong because you started off false. So we all have to start off with knowing what to believe. Now, you could the distinction between knowing and believing, you can, and it's kind of a academic distinction in a way, which I hate to make because it sounds so pedantic. But you can only know what is true. You can only know what is true, but you can believe anything. You can believe absolutely anything. And so you can train yourself up to whatever limits that you have. Everybody will have different limits. You can train yourself, but the best way to do that is to read. You can watch videos and all this kind of stuff, and that's helpful to some extent. But you have to read what are considered the classics, and all. They're classics for a reason. Right. Read this stuff, especially anything written before, I don't know, just to pick an arbitrary date, before society became woke, before it became wholly progressive and so forth. Don't read bestsellers for the sake of reading bestsellers. You're liable to make more mistakes than otherwise. So this book, the one I showed, I just picked up some various. I just gave all these fallacies fanciful names. They all have Latin names, but nobody can remember the Latin anymore. So I went with fanciful names. Just what I thought, here's the most common stuff you see in the media and from politicians and from experts trying to fool you using these kind of debating tactics like Hitchens used all the time. Just try to help you think your way through them. It's not easy. It's not easy, especially in the heat of the moment. You get caught up by emotion and in the heat of the argument and so forth. You are very liable to be swept away by those kinds of things.
Yeah, one thing actually I feel must branch into your area of statistics is, again, within my field, when we're analyzing, player performance or which team's better, I have to say, everyone else in my field, I'm almost on a one-man crusade against them. My thinking is antithetical, because what they do is we have amazing statistical databases basically in the game that can track all kinds of stats. It's somewhat like baseball, where you can track a million different stats for the different roles in the game, and you can track all the team stats and stylistic elements. And so the problem is everyone else worships these stats. They actually seem to have this weird fallacy that humans are flawed, therefore the machine is right, and the data the machine spits out is like the gospel truth. And the reason I always seem to be on this crusade against them is I always try to tell them things like, but first of all, a human programmed the machine. The machine isn't actually a god. It's not some external entity. It's actually, in some ways, it's actually a worse version of a human. If you want to get it to analyze, all it can do is produce mass data. And the other mistake they make is they think the data they even use this phrasing. It's very telling. They say it tells them this, or the data says this player is better. And I always say it doesn't. The data just suggests or points in a direction. You've got to go down the path, and with your human brain, intuit or rationalize what is going on there. And in terms of whether the computer tells you something, no, it doesn't tell you one player's better. It tells you one player's metric is higher than the other. You'd have to watch the player to know that. I mean, even if you don't know my games, the obvious example would be something like baseball. Two players could have 50 home runs, but that doesn't really tell us they're equally as good if we watch them, and maybe the style of how they do it, or where they are, the pitching lineup, or what their teams are. There's a million factors you could see that could bring in here that the single factor of the home runs won't help you with. So what would you say on this area? I'm sure in the statistical world, I mean, I feel like statistics in the modern day media are almost exclusively used to trick people like this and propagandize them in a certain way.
You have just summarized the class. I just began an online class. Anybody can take it. It's free. Teaching one of the books I wrote. You've just summarized it entirely. No, the data don't tell you anything. The data, for one thing, you must have had a theory or a model in mind to collect certain data in the first place. Why are you collecting this data? What does it mean? How does it fit into some scheme? The data don't tell you anything. You have to build on top of that some sort of model on top of that. A model in statistical terms, but it doesn't have to be formally written down with equations and everything. It has to be some conceptual scheme, whether formal or informal. That's a model. That's all a model is. And so your take on how to handle this kind of stuff is exactly right. And it's not like everything or all performance can be quantified. I like to call it trying to quantify the unquantifiable. You can't. And the example I always like to use is of course I don't know what games you're talking about, so I'll just use something everybody knows, like happiness.
Sure.
And so you're trying to quantify happiness. Well, how happy are you on a scale from 1 to 10? Well, you got the data, and you've asked one country, Scotland, a bunch of people the question on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? And then you move over to France, and then you ask them the same question, and then you try to compare the scores and say, well, French people are happier than Scottish people. It doesn't mean a damn thing.
Yes.
Because what is happy? Happy is ebullient, joyous, pleased. There's thousands of different connotations of happiness. What does it mean? What does it mean in the context? What does one number mean over another? Is moving from 5 points of happiness to 6 points of happiness exactly the same for everybody universally as moving from 6 points of happiness to 7 points of happiness? There's no way to know. There's just no way to know. So all these exceedingly crude things that people then use and become, like you say, official. This is the official answer, and we're going to use it now. So that all that stuff should be viewed with great, vast uncertainty.
I mean, yes, this is obviously, if people don't know, you're talking about the book Uncertainty that you also wrote. Another question along these lines I would ask then is, people do feel, I notice it's essentially like an appeal to authority fallacy, but when people hear an official number or they're told a statistic or a metric means this, I mean, classic ones in politics and news are like GDP means this country's doing better than another one, even though, again, if you actually went there, I mean, maybe the quality of life would be awesome in this country that has a terrible GDP. Maybe it'd be terrible in some of the high GDP countries. Again, what do we value in life, essentially? Things like, obviously, without going into the obvious one, illnesses, certain things. Oh, this marker here means that this thing causes that, which again, doesn't necessarily. That's a story we tell ourselves, isn't it? It's a way of rationalizing or trying to approximate what that could mean. In this sort of an aspect, as someone who's in the fields of statistics, is it something that's like a constant bane to you, the idea that essentially people use something that you've devoted a lot of your life to in a way where, I mean, first of all, in the topic of uncertainty, they're making it certainty. They're actually coming to very hard black and white conclusions. And then also, whereas it could be used, if people could see it this way, as like an interesting, it could essentially, I always say this, I say the statistic maybe causes you to pose a question. It never tells you the answer. You have to come up with the answer through your own method. So is it a bane of yours to see statistics essentially misused or misappropriated to kind of push people's mind or worldview in a certain way?
Absolutely. Unquestionably. No doubt about it. I mean, I've demonstrated again and again and again, weekly. I write articles. Somebody's, they find a new study says, research shows, experts say, kind of a thing. And you look behind it, and it's all of these vast uncertainties that are just washed away in the absolute, need for certainty, and the need to say this causes this, the need to say this is the final answer, or this is the worst one of all. This is the science. Follow the science, and on. Absolutely, no question. There's and part of the problem is ours. The people in academia and everything who promulgated these methods that people use, which are wholly inferior and completely wrong as far as pointing towards what causes what and all this kind of a thing. These methods should not be used. All they do is they take a set of data that, again, it's just like in your field. They picked this data to measure. They said this data was important because they thought it would fit their model. And then they look at how closely that data fit the model that they themselves originated. And if that data fits the model well, they announced, all right, I have discovered something. It just doesn't work that way. It does not work that way, because you could always, absolutely always, this is just one of these mathematical facts you can prove to people. You can always take any set of data you want, and I can find a model that fits that data perfectly.
Right.
Absolutely perfectly. Every time. It's not even a question. This is a necessary truth that I could do this. Therefore, it just can't be that all these models that I spit out have anything to say about reality. It just doesn't follow. And so the whole practice that we teach people how to do this kind of stuff is wrong in and of itself. And trying to get people to understand that has been for a very long time exceedingly difficult, because as a guy named Gerd Gigerenzer, he's a psychologist, he puts it, it's ritualized. They have these ritualized procedures. You submit your data to this software, and out comes a number. And if this number meets a criterion, why then you have performed the ritual. Magic has occurred.
Yes.
You're now able to get your paper published and foisted upon the world. All of that, absolutely all of that. So your thinking is exactly the right way to do it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad stuff. It's changing somewhat, though, now that the so-called AI, artificial intelligence, and so forth, and machine learning, fancy terms that just mean predictive models, as opposed to the more classical models.
It's funny as well, because obviously all mathematical based subjects, one of the things people in those fields often pride themselves on is exactly the notion that like they are working with some like hard rules of the universe, or this is the language of, God or whatever the fuck, but I noticed the majority of them are atheistic. And so the funny thing I even thought of when I thought of how statistics is used is I feel like another thing people are, a hole that people are filling in themselves with the statistics, like I said about the people in my field, trusting the computer's data over their own eyes and mind, is it's like they've just outsourced the religious capacity to a machine. And in this case, the machine is sort of like, I don't know, God's mind, and then the people who tailor the data and tell you what their conclusions are, they're the priest class, I guess. And it's why even obviously people will, to some degree, they eventually get happy enough not even needing to know what the process was or how did you come up with the metric. They're just happy to know at the end what is, essentially tell me what to believe. Like, I feel like, because one of my things I've been on the last few years, mate, is I'm not like a very religious person, but I've been coming back to it step by step because I've kind of realized I do sort of think it is a hard-coded faculty within people, and that even if you deny it, and I for a long time I because I said like Christopher Hitchens, I was a rational materialist for a long time, and then I realized essentially you're always sort of putting something in those same circuits in your brain, whether it be reason and logic, maybe that becomes your God, maybe your priest class becomes Christopher Hitchens or Hegel or Goethe or something, you know. So what would you say to this aspect? I feel like people in the modern day, even though they're thinking they're being using reason, they're actually almost treating statistics like it is magic, like you say, like it's a supernatural force.
Yeah, absolutely. Two things. So yes, they do this. They program the computer. The computer is just a dumb box. It does nothing more than what you told it to do. Nothing. You might not have realized what you've told it to do, but it only does what it is told to do. All models, absolutely every model under creation, only does what you tell it to do. And so they forget this. They forget that they put these equations in themselves, that they derive these equations themselves, and then the computer spits it back at them, and it does become like it's somehow to them it does become indeed like it's a second source, confirming what they themselves have believed, and they do take it on some kind of authority that this computer has spoken to them, and it's just it's a funny thing to see. But it happens again and again and again and again. We see it. We just see it absolutely constantly. And as far as the other stuff goes, it just so I was like yourself. I was born and raised Catholic, Roman Catholic, and I got away from the church and became a scientist, all this kind of a stuff. And the reason I came back to the church, is for the very because of science, because I realized why is the universe the way it is, and it brings you back to questions like why is there something rather than nothing? Sure. And it has to be that the universe is the way it is for some sort of cause, and that cause can't be chance or anything like that, because that chance is a matter of mind and not of physicality. And so I reasoned myself back into it just by these same ways. So you don't have to have religious enlightenment experiences, all this kind of a thing, that spiritual experiences that some people have. You can reach these same paths in the same way you become a scientist. When you stop and consider, where does all this stuff come from? It has to have a source. And then you're led back into asking how this source came about, how many sources could there be, what is the nature of this source, what does it mean to cause something, all these kinds of things. And that's how I finally convinced myself that, to return to the church anyway.
Yeah, this is actually something I did want to talk with you about, which is another thing I actually found it funny, because if you look online, it's one of the few things people critique you about in their reviews. They'll be like, I like the book, but there's kind of like a weird religious element in here, which he doesn't really go into, but it just sort of like, for example, he'll just say and God exists, and then he'll go on to the next part of the thing. And so what I found was funny about this is something I want to ask you about, because I had a similar path. I grew up religious. When I thought I'd become educated, I will say some of this is social programming. It made me think things like, what did my parents know? What did my family know? That's outdated stuff anyway. I'm on the cutting edge here. I'm reading books about science and reason. As I say, they somewhat became my God in some way. And the interesting thing I found was I actually realized now sort of the folly of youth, which is whenever people religious who were intelligent and were people who were grounded in these topics and maybe had like a very deep, actually, I'd almost say mystical understanding of the world as opposed to a rational understanding, when they would tell me things, I wasn't listening. I would just hear them say these things like, well, it's about belief and you've got to take the leap of faith and haven't you ever like felt that there's more of the, and I would just think things like, oh, I would essentially just push it through the prism of my rational materialist worldview, go, oh, right, what he's done there is, unlike me, he doesn't understand like deep physical concepts about how the universe could form. So he's just come up with this simple explanation. And what I had to realize was I wasn't listening to them saying words like belief. They weren't actually, look, there are some Christians, I think, make the mistake of making it sound like it's all science-based. I think that's not really a great approach, because essentially this is another thing. To me, it's the reason it's a different domain to some degrees. It's about belief, not reason. And as you say, reason actually, if you just look at the outcome on life and thinking, it can only take you so far. Like, to me, it clearly is just one faculty, but it's been elevated to almost like the super faculty in humans, and everything else has to be subordinate to it. But I do feel like that this is why I say I'm kind of being drawn back, I feel, into the religious or the mystical worldview. Is I do actually feel once I engage the faculty of belief, which I had to sort of reignite the flame of to some degree, and it actually does remind me some of like childish fervor to some degree. You can have these grand ideas and believe in things. I actually see that, like, I have to say, one of the biggest selling points is it actually opens up the beauty of the world and life to me in a way that rational materialism could never address.
Yes, belief is so belief. Like I say, people believe for all kind of fallacious reasons, but it turns out our most fundamental reasons or reasoning powers and everything all rest on belief. So, for instance, you make a logical argument. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Yes.
Well, how do you know? Well, of course, that's a logical argument. You can reason out. Well, how do you know it's true? How can you prove that it's true? How can you prove certain things are absolutely true? And it turns out you can't. Yes. You cannot verify. In mathematics, we call them axioms. I'm very fond of using the Peano axiom. It says that for all natural numbers, x and y, we'll just take two numbers. If x equals y, then y equals x.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Yeah, it works for 1. It works for 2. It works for 3. You can't prove it, though. It's not provable.
Right.
You cannot prove it. There's nobody who's checked all infinite numbers, but it's obviously true. It's just obviously true. But there we've just have a belief. We've used a form of induction. There's lots of forms of induction to form a belief that has no rational basis. In other words, it's not based on some sort of logical argument or anything like this. And so all of the rules of logic that we use and the rules of mathematics that we use in order to build reasons for things that we think we're doing these wonderful things, all of them, every single one, rests on just these same kinds of beliefs. Absolutely. Everything at base is faith. And it's no escaping it. There's absolutely no escaping it. I'm going to have a class on this, not this coming Monday, but the Monday after. So I'm sort of preparing my notes just as we're talking about this. So it's sort of all fresh in my mind. I'll have many more examples on this that people can tune into if they're interested in looking at these kinds of things, because perhaps this short demonstration isn't enough. But so you're saying all of our information comes to us through our senses. And so how do we know that they're never fooling us? Well, you have to have a belief. You have to have faith that they're not always fooling us, although they sometimes can. So how can we reason and know any truths if we believe that our minds are fallible because, well, maybe we're only creatures that were produced by some sort of evolutionary process?
Sure.
We don't have the facility to really know truth. There can't be real truth because we're only going to believe beliefs. We're only going to take propositions that are comforting to us or useful in our survival. Well, you've just stated a belief.
Yes.
You've just stated a truth that I have to believe. So you do have some truths. You do have some beliefs. It's that we don't have any beliefs. So it's self-contradictory. So all of this stuff eventually ends up in belief and in faith. And there's absolutely no escaping it. It turns out that these kinds of intuitions or inductions, if you like, these infinite leaps that we make to grasp these universals and so forth, our most fundamental, deepest parts of our knowledge. And it's not logic and rationality and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff is downstream, and it's all very good, very useful stuff. I'm not, denigrating it or saying don't study or anything like this. I do not mean that. I mean to say that you can't do all that other stuff, all that fancy math and all this fancy logic and so forth, without this other stuff coming first. And all of us, to come back to your very first question, have a portion of this, but not everybody can see to the same extent.
Sure. Because on the topic of uncertainty, I'm actually quite sure for people in the rational materialist worldview, even that word is almost a bit scary and a bit spooky. Like, uncertainty. Like, what would it be like to not know what's true or what is the case? And people do want pleasing answers and they want comforting thoughts. Funnily enough, they decry these things when they're in a religious form because they see them as charlatanry. But they don't notice, like we say about how statistics and science things can be used to mislead or to essentially disingenuously suggest a consensus or a fact. And I have to say, when you look into this area, it's actually the opposite to what people probably fear, which is that they'll be untethered, unmoored, and suddenly they'll just be cast on some chaotic waves that they won't be able to navigate. I would actually say that, to me, first of all, what they think is the solid rock they stand on, like you say, just a bunch of beliefs. They've never looked into actually the mathematics and the physics behind the Big Bang. They just hear it like a creation story, but they think it's not a creation story, it's a fact. Therefore, to them, they never need to think about how would the universe start or life start something, because to them, okay, I was told it was a Big Bang and then it was evolutionary, natural selection and all that sort of stuff. Similarly, when they think about things like what realm do they live in now, and what happens after death, they just go to scientific beliefs like, right, when you die, brain function ceases and then your body becomes composted. And again, whether these are comforting or not, this is just how they sort of pin down in their mind big topics that do haunt people, that are the sort of philosophical existential topics of the ages. But I have to say, I'd say it's the opposite. I feel like once you embrace uncertainty, you understand that belief essentially fills these gaps one way or another, whether it's via science or something else. And in this case, I would say the part I didn't understand about religion was there is a heavy intuitive part to it. Like, one of the things that also brought me back, unironically, was I actually just saw one of the ones that interested me was actually orthodoxy. I saw a lot of orthodox icons, and for some bizarre reason, I'd seen them in the past in my life. I was maybe just in the right headspace, and they did like have a magnetic pull to me. There was something more than just a piece of art from whatever 17th century or something. There was something about them was speaking to me, or something archetypally that was awakening something in me. So what would you say in this sense? Because I feel like people are scared to be uncertain, but I've actually found it to be very freeing, and in some ways to be able to surrender to certain things that will always be unknowable, like we were discussing earlier. That's actually been more of a comfort to me than thinking I knew about things I'd never investigated.
Absolutely. I mean, you put it better than I could put it. And just to bring it into the religious sense, in the church they have the idea of mystery, not in the whodunit sense, but things that are revealed truths that have no explanation or any explanation that we could know and so forth. So there's always uncertainty. How can this thing be true? But this stuff is at the basis of everything. So I like to use the example, the number pi, it's 3.1417, blah, blah, blah. It goes out to infinite number of digits. So, okay, why is it that way? Why is why is pi this particular value? Why you could have some theorems and derive pi and so forth, but it doesn't answer the question how. It's still a mystery why a lot of things are the way they are. We just don't know, yes. And we'll never be able to know. I mean, the role of science, of course, is to try to move as much contingency as they can. Contingency are these beliefs about the world that don't have to be the way they are. Most things in science are contingent. So they try to remove this contingency and build higher levels. So, for instance, we know the speed of light is some value. They call it c, okay? But nobody knows why it's that value. There's uncertainty there. There's no deduction that comes before it saying, if you use these formulas, you'll be able to deduce this is what the speed of light should be. And all of this stuff, it just comes back earlier and earlier. All of these equations, and even if somebody comes up with one, you're not going to be able to explain the equations that you used to explain the value of the speed of light. Those equations then will have derived a fundamental aspect of belief from them. And if you could figure out where those came from, eventually you're always back to these fundamental axioms, if you like, of logic and mathematics,
Sure.
and of science and measurement and so forth, which we just believe. So again, it's all based on faith, but it doesn't mean that we always can figure out the answer to stuff. We can. There's always going to be elements of uncertainty in all things, and of course we should try to chase down what we can. But like yourself, I find it more freeing to know that you don't want to embrace a false certainty. Because when you embrace a false certainty, you're going to be making an error, and that error will have consequences. What those consequences are, well, that depends on the individual and the uses to which the error are put. But it's always better to have a full understanding of the uncertainty that you have in any particular problem, so that you can make better decisions based on whatever it is. You can formally quantify this and in a science kind of way, or you can just leave it vague, the way most of our actions are like this. So if you do have genuine uncertainty and you embrace that, it's just a much simpler way of living.
One thing about your work I've very much appreciated, because it kind of made me have almost an epiphany about my own output, has been I was kind of naively, because a lot of us do this fallacy where we essentially think other people are like we are, and we just sort of kind of transfer a version of our mind to their mind and think, they're a little bit different. Maybe they're a woman, maybe they're this old, but we think for example, we make assumptions like they care about truth more than everything else, or they have certain principles we have, or that good person would, and other conflations. And I will say one area I often ran into a lot of frustration in my work is I thought, if I care, I always say I'm a radical, I believe in radical honesty. Like in my professional career, I have never knowingly lied, and I've worked in 20 plus years, which I always say it sounds like a strange flex, but I don't know many other people who've ever said to me they could say the same thing in their field. So in that scenario, I have put truth as a very high principle for me. And so I've always thought in my work, right, if I can express this thing I'm trying to explain as truthfully as possible and come to the best conclusion and show my working and sort of lead people along, and then they'll come with me, they'll have the same experience I do, and at the end they'll agree I was right and this is correct and this will be really popular as well. And what I've found, obviously, this is someone who publishes, is that couldn't be further from the truth. Like, really, the way you put it was, it's about what the winning story is. It's not about the best conclusion or what's most true. People want a certain story that explains this thing, and if possible, yes, potentially maybe comforts them or tells them, mirrors back to them that they're right or something they've thought is the case. And I feel like that's something I missed for so long, because I would see people where I would think, but their work's just not as good, or they haven't even done the legwork here. They've sort of just made some assertions. They haven't really tied it together. It's not even coherent. But I would realize, no, but the way they're selling it, though, the way they're packaging it together, the actual overall narrative aspect that they're using to bring the person along. In fact, sometimes maybe I was being naive, thinking if I lay out the breadcrumbs, they'll follow me. Maybe holding the person's hand and dragging them along in some cases is more effective for winning people over. What do you say to this? Because as much as maybe you and I in our work want to be very regimented with our protocols and feel like we understood the first principles we came from, there's an element of publishing which always is performative. You want someone to read it. You want someone to get something out of it. So is this something you struggle with? What would you say about this? Because I feel like essentially politics is just about the winning story, right?
Oh, unquestionably. Absolutely. The appeals to emotion in politics are predominate, and they always will, and there's no escaping that, I don't think. But you're quite right about argumentation. There, you can have a perfectly rigorous logical argument. Here's the first premise. You get it? You understand it? Okay. Here's the second premise. You get it? You understand? Okay. And you go on, and here's the reasoning. Here's how they tie together. Now let me bring in this other fact. And you can, as you say, lead these breadcrumbs, and they come to an inescapable conclusion, or a conclusion that has some uncertainty in it, whatever the case may be. But the tricks that people use, they don't even know they're using these tricks. Their desire for a different conclusion can drag them in absolutely every possible direction. So the only way to do it is to beat people over the head with absolutely every premise and every step, and getting them to agree that leads them to this final conclusion, whatever it is. And that's just extremely difficult to do, especially when there's emotion involved and they don't want to believe it. And they use every trick in the book. And I wrote a bunch of them, and you know a bunch of them, just to avoid the consequences that are absolutely deeply unloved. So there's no, how do you do it? All I can do is say, you repeat. My wife says, repeat,
Okay.
repeat. So I do repeat. I'm sick of repeating this stuff. People must be sick of reading me repeating this
Sure.
stuff. So you just write it over and over again. And you try to say, if you agree with this, then you must agree with this. But it just, you're never going to get everybody. One thing about writing, I've been writing for a while. You're not going to, there's no way. Don't try. I mean,
Yes.
You could try to get everybody, but don't be disappointed when
Yes.
nobody follows you, or you have to write for yourself. And so they always say, find an audience. And I think that my audience is myself. And I just want to write so that I understand what it is that I'm trying to talk about. So I sort it out all in my own mind. And then maybe add a few jokes or something on top of it, because I can't stop myself. It's a terrible habit. But that's what I do. Just write for myself so it's clear in my own mind.
I have to say, I think your wife's potentially more wise than people might realize there, because something I've also found in my work is something similar. I would make a mistake of thinking, well, if I read a book about a topic or a really great paper, I don't want to read the same topic, rephrased 700 times after that. I'll go back to the original one if I do. But I realized I'm not like most people in that sense. And also, so for example, in my work, one thing I started trying to do is don't worry about repeating myself. If anything, it can become like, you see, when someone's an author or a comedian or whatever, they have a bit that they work on, they refine, and they keep working out better ways to say it and better ways to frame it. And if you do this, first of all, it's ever present in the mind of the reader, of the listener. But I also say, from my own perspective, because you're not always ready or in the right place to receive a piece of information or an epiphany or some wisdom at some point in time. There's a famous saying, I forget who said it, something like, sometimes you have to hear something 1,000,000 times, and then on the 1,001st time, it sort of clicks with you. I'd say a good example here would be, I'm sure people know musicians that are like this. You have a musician, you think, everything about their aesthetic, maybe some other work they did with someone else, I'm sure I'll be into this person. But you keep listening and you think, that just doesn't vibe with me, it just doesn't click. But then you come back 10 years later, or you hear a song just on a radio in some random pub years and years later, and you think, who is that? And suddenly you've just keyed into it, and it's almost like you're on the same wavelength as that person, and then maybe it all opens up to you, and you think, I'm glad I didn't actually dismiss that initially. So I feel like, as much as it might sound like, it's just encouragement, like keep repeating, I actually think it is valuable. Like, when the person's almost ready, it'll be allowed entry to the mind, I feel like.
Oh, absolutely. And it works for individuals and their own studies too. I encourage, so I read, so when I was starting off, I started off in physics in my academic career. And so I tend to think physically, and then I switched over into mathematics, and they do math in an entirely different way than the physicists do it. And I was perplexed and flummoxed for the longest time, because I was trying to think of these objects they were writing down as real physical objects instead of entirely different things. But you read about this stuff and you don't get it, and then you come back to it at some point later, and all of a sudden it's clear, and you don't know why. You haven't been thinking about it, you haven't been working on it, and all of a sudden I get it now, and I don't know how I get it. That's because your mind is always working, and you don't know quite how it works. Nobody knows how the mind works. That's another thing. Computers do not well map how minds work at all. Yes. No question about that. And we can discuss that ad infinitum too. So yes, keep studying, keep trying. You never know how it's going to work out in the end.
Sure. No, I actually have a little joke for you along those lines. So in the modern day, when obviously the thing in vogue is to go on and on about AI and language learning machines and make them sound like they're any kind of approximation to a human mind, well, you probably get this like I do. If you go on Twitter, x.com, a type of ad that keeps getting served to me is always someone saying like, you're falling behind because you're not using AI. Everyone else in your field is using it. And I always think this is my little joke. The way you'd know AI had come anywhere somewhere close, and it's a million miles now, the way you'd know it was even vaguely close to a human mind is you wouldn't be telling me that tweet, an AI would be. And I wouldn't need to be convinced. It would already be outpacing me. I would see that there was a real intelligence outpacing me. And then I would have to figure out, am I going to get in the game here or am I going to change fields? Like the idea you're selling it to me at the moment, AI to me basically feels like those really early sort of charlatan tricks of the olden times where they would pretend they had machines, but it's actually like a little guy, a dwarf inside pulling the lever, or, you know, all these sorts of fantastical things they'd have where, again, it's like you said at the beginning, it wasn't about that there was actually like a real thing there. It just had to appear like it was. It had to just seem like you said about wanting to be tricked by mentalism. Half the trick is in making the person comfortable enough to not think, is this fake? To actually go, yeah, this is real, and I'm going to put my faith and my belief into it and my confidence. And so, on the AI one, I think that's actually one of the biggest distractions everyone has nowadays, because they talk like, you notice it's become another vector for like the utopia that is promised by the scientists and the rational materialists, whereas as far as I can tell at the moment, it's kind of a mirage.
Of course, yes, it is. No question about it. Look, I give the example, an abacus. Everybody knows what an abacus is.
Yes.
It's just this thing with wooden beads. You slide a bead, and this is a number. You slide another bead, and now you've made an addition, and so forth. You slide these beads around. That's all a computer does. Instead of using wooden beads, it uses electrical impulses. That's it. It does it very fast.
Yes.
And you could do it at large scale. But at what point does this thing start thinking? It never does. It never does. It is just a machine, nothing more. And so all these tricks about language models and so forth, they're all just tricks. They're hard-coded tricks, and they're all sorts of fancy stuff that they build onto them. And they do a very good job at some things. You know, they can produce good fake images and, you know, this sort of trivial stuff, and you can't trust what you see because of it sometimes. There's no question about it. But as far as so I just read this paper, and I haven't written about it yet. So these lunatic scientists don't have data for a particular field. They want to have data to be able to model data on, of course, minorities or something like this. Okay. Everything has to be about diversity and so forth. We don't have data on this. So what we did was we used this sophisticated. It's always sophisticated, powerful. They like to use the word powerful AI to generate the data. All right. So they generated the data. Then they fit their model to it. And then they make the conclusion, yes, it turns out when the world ends, women and minorities will be hardest hit.
Sure.
I think it was in Nature or some big journal.
Right.
I've yet to write about it. I only read through the thing once. It's preposterous. It's entirely circular thinking. There's nothing going on in AI. It's just doing exactly what you told it to do. And you tell it to make up fictitious data, it'll make up fictitious data in the exact way you told it to make it up. And so you can't go in and look at it and say, aha, look at, I have discovered. You've discovered nothing. You were the one who said this in the first place.
Yes.
And so this is the level of idiocy. It's just plain idiocy that we've reached with AI. And people, older in the field will remember machine learning was going to do this for us maybe 10 years ago. And before that, maybe 20 years ago, to 30 years ago, it was neural nets. Neural nets were models of neurons in the brain. And they were going to do all this same kind of stuff. The only thing that's gotten better now is computing power, and able to move these bits around faster and faster and store more of them while the computers got bigger. That's all. There's nothing fancier in any of this stuff. There's nothing fancier than an abacus at all. It's just bigger and faster.
Yes. When in my space, I originally started that crusade I described earlier against stats. Another thing I used to say, I've now changed my position on, is I would try and use a philosophical framework. I would say to people, what I've done is I've essentially figured out my own first principles of how these games work. And then what I do is I ponder how those protocols would work. And then I take the data and I input it. And as a result, I felt like I was being really clever, because then whatever it spits out at the end, I wasn't biased, right? I actually like I didn't sort of like get the player I want to be the best or the team I want to be the best and then figure out, like you say, a reason or a model as to why they are. This way, it's almost like at the end, the conclusion agreed with me or it didn't. But the reason I don't use that anymore is because I realized, like you said earlier, I was the one who came up with the principles. So I'd essentially baked in there a lot of subjective stuff that I was already thinking. It's just I was pretending it was external to me. So nowadays, I always say within the field of sports, my ultimate like principle or God within this field is the eye test. It's just what my eye can see with a large enough sample size. My brain processes it. I have feelings which try and I intuit things about it. And at the end, I come up with an answer, which, listen, to the person who's, again, in the rational materialist world, they're going to think that's very wishy-washy. It's not very good. I would say, I've found the best outcomes doing that way. I don't find machines or stats any kind of a proxy for those kinds of judgments that only a human can make. And so what I wanted to ask was this. I feel like one of the things that's incredibly dishonest about explanations from science, I'm sure there are many studies which you can just, it's up to you how you interpret them or how you read the abstract and how you read the conclusion at the end, etc. But when people take these conclusions from science and they're told certain things, one of the most dangerous things seems to be that they don't acknowledge that humans and their desires and their intuitions were ever involved in the process. They make it sound like it really was a guy with a Bunsen burner, a guy with a microscope, a guy with an electron magnetoscope, a guy with a fucking scalpel, someone with chemicals. They think it's all this hard science that somehow producing these results. But I would say one of the main things, and by the way, I'm making this abstract, so I don't want to hit any of the third rail topics. One of the things I would say you do a very good job with on your Substack, it's almost an obsession of yours at this point in time, is sort of pointing out how people actually in the modern day go from reverse. They take what they want to believe about themselves, about people, about what is good, about what is progress, about what things should be like. I would say this is a religious impulse, again, pushed through the prism of science or politics in this case. And then they make the data fit that. So even though people might think, no, we did a study that shows that, this particular demographic performs in this way. It's like, at the end of the day, the reason why you're always going to be led down a path there, especially if you don't know what that person's motivations are, is it can't just be like it isn't like a true statement what they're delivering. It's always baked into their ideology and what they want the world to be like to some degree, right?
Absolutely, positively, yes. I always give the line, every scientist knows about confirmation bias, and when they go through school, they learn various examples of it in their own individual fields and so forth. But none of them ever expect it's going to apply to them.
Sure.
Absolutely never. But they do it, and they don't know they're doing it. They think they're being logical and rational and so forth. And they're not tested because it's now become very rude to test people or critique them and criticize them and so forth. There does exist some people who look around for fraud and the like, and when fraud is found, which is not that often, there's a lot more fraud that occurs than is being found out. People will say, okay, this is fraudulent, let's get rid of it, and okay, let's move back on. But to actually critique people, to say, hey, so-and-so, you're wrong, and here's why you're absolutely wrong, that's not taken so well right now. I mean, science, the sociology of science is changed greatly. It used to be, back in the old days, in the very old days, in a math seminar or physics seminar or something like this, you were plotting some equations on the board, and some guy in the middle of your talk says, hey, I don't buy that. That can't be right. And it would be a lot more combative. And as without getting too political about it, as science looks more like society as a whole, a nice mix of men and women in there and so forth.
Sure.
We all have to be nice. Everybody has to be nice.
Yes.
And so these errors just sort of build and compound. And what happens is these particular, some character comes up with some result that's ridiculous, and it becomes a result that everybody looks to. And then all sorts of other people go at it and say, well, we haven't seen how it's done over here. We haven't seen how this result works if we incorporate smokers, or we haven't seen it if we're going to incorporate. So they build on this research, and they use the same wrong techniques and errors and all this kind of stuff that the first people done. And all of a sudden it becomes a massive research. You have this body of research. You've got dozens to hundreds or more papers all on this topic, all of them absolutely wrong. But everybody points to the activity and the money that's flowing into it, and the fact that so many people are interested in and working on it, that there must be something to it. And it's complete, they've completely fooled themselves, and nobody then has the strength or the will or or the political savvy to be able to say no to this stuff, and it just goes on and on. Science has become too big. That's the problem. So science itself has just become too big. There's too much money. There's too many scientists. There's too many people who calling themselves scientists. There's too many results. It's just too easy to do science. Anybody can do it. It's just ridiculously easy. The software is all free now, or close to free. You could just pump out results all day long, and it's making everything much, much worse.
One reason I would say that this kind of thinking that we've been outlining and you talk about in your books and your articles is so useful and so efficacious to me is it actually, to me, it's sort of like, it's essentially the machete that lets you cut through the jungle of all these opinions and beliefs and things that stories that people want to convince you of, and, tribal signaling and stuff. Because I think one thing a lot of people get caught in, it's not exactly a unique observation to say this, is just the divide and conquer of like, which wing are you of the party are you on, or are you a left wing or a right wing, or what are you, accelerationist or traditional? They have all these different labels and polarities they want to pull you towards. But what I've noticed is, unless you're using these kinds of thinking methods, it doesn't matter which one you pick or you're drawn to or you naturally think is true. You'll still be believing nonsense and absolutely made up stories, and your mind will protect you against certain truths that otherwise you would have uncovered if you'd used some of these approaches. Because I feel like even though I'm fairly sure I could guess. I mean, in the modern day, just demographically you can guess, mate. But I could probably guess some of your political leanings and ideas from reading your work. I would say you do a very good job of essentially goring the sacred oxes of the political persuasions people might think you're aligned with, and you certainly don't just tribally signal or ignore things. I mean, a classic example you gave is the most obvious political fallacy of all time is like, well, this person that's on your party does X. And it's like, well, the guy before was doing X as well. It's like, what's this? Like, you're not even addressing the topic at that point in time. You're just in some sort of weird point scoring contest. So how is this something that's, what was your political evolution in that sense? Like, were you someone where you once upon a time, you were in a particular wing and you thought a certain way? Were you able to apply these things way back? Is this more of a new phenomenon for you? Because I actually find it very useful.
Yeah, the fallacy you're talking about is the so's your old man fallacy.
Yeah.
That's used all the time, absolutely all the time. When you bring up somebody, some country, some entity, some political party did some bad thing, and they'll say, oh yeah, well, your guy did worse. As if that's some kind of an excuse,
yes,
or a reason, or it's a distraction. It's always a distraction. Just thank them calmly. So you agree that my guy did, your guy did something bad, or your party did something bad, or the entity you favor is wrong, and then try to move on from that. It's very difficult to do because your emotion gets involved, because someone's calling you names or something like this, and then it's always
sure.
you always want to smack back. So my political evolution was, I was apolitical, for a large number of years. When I was in the military, I was sort of apolitical. And when I was in grad school, if anything, I leaned kind of left, like everybody did back in grad school. It wasn't as profound as they do now or so forth. And then I started questioning all my beliefs. I'm not in any way... I like to say I'm in the party of reality. Whatever is most closest to reality, and then what I can know of reality, that's the political persuasion that I have. And I try to understand all of the errors that people have made throughout history and so forth. And there's so much thinking that's gone on in this political theory and so forth. I mean, since Aristotle, and even before in the pre-Socratics and so forth, all of these lessons we have to continuously relearn. It's all there, really, but we always think we're in a unique situation, that somehow the position that we're in has never been seen before. In some cases, it's true. There's more people alive, and the ways we communicate with each other are different and so forth. But it doesn't mean that people's nature has really changed. And so all of these political ideas. So I came to more classical views. I think that's the way to put it. more classic reality-based views.
One thing as sort of a closing topic I wanted to ask you about is actually quite a personal thing, but it's to do with your professional life, which is another area I've had to walk the tightrope the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years, is that now everything has really been politicized to a degree that even when before the puzzle was political or whatever people said, now it's obviously hyper accelerated. Like every single statement of truth or belief essentially is a partisan topic and tribally signals which side you're on. And depending on that tribal signaling, people will actually potentially have reprisals against you, like either just your reputation. Obviously they can I mean, verbal abuse can be pretty nasty too, but even obviously things like trying to encroach upon where you can work or who could sponsor you or how you make your money, and etc. And these things in the modern day really can lead to a feeling of almost like you're a medieval alchemist who's living under the Inquisition. You have to hide things and signal to people with codes, and you can't be overt about certain things. I've noticed one of the things I would say it's quite impressive is when you write on your Substack, you are pretty forthright. Like in this conversation, I've already made it clear, because it's going to go on YouTube, that I don't touch certain third rail topics. I try to essentially extract the abstract principle and talk about that, because you don't tend to get in trouble if you don't use what I call the cursed words, the words other people have loaded up in media and society with certain meanings. And even if you mean something different, that's not what's going to signal to someone else. So I actually find this quite tricky though. So I wanted to know, is you're doing the Substack, and principally your books are all on Amazon, even though, by the way, I would actually say, obviously I hope this doesn't get you any trouble, I would say if some of the people from Amazon looked into it, like, I don't know whether politically they would agree with some of the interesting points you've made about certain demographic aspects, for example, even though I certainly think they're very well reasoned, and I intuitively think they have a point to them. How do you manage to sort of avoid the eye of the censors, as it were? Has Substack allowed you to carve out a little sort of niche in the world where people who vibe with that comment somehow the sort of bigger mainstream figures that could cancel you, for a better word, don't come? Or have you had that experience? What would you say?
Oh yeah, I was canceled. I was canceled several times. I was at
Right.
Cornell. I was teaching at Cornell in a master's program, and I was not invited back. I was teaching in a master's level statistics program there, and they fired me and replaced me with a woman sexual harassment lawyer.
Okay.
Her specialty. So she's teaching a master's level statistics course. Oh yeah, I've had many people. I've lost jobs. I guess I could tell you the topic, even though we don't want to try to mention it, but for being a certain denier.
Oh, of course.
For being a certain kind of denier. I've lost jobs that way, and told I've lost jobs. I've lost friends because of the tumultuous politics in the United States and so forth. So yeah, I'm well canceled. I'm entirely independent now because of it. No university would dare hire me or touch me or anything like this. I wouldn't fill out the required statements, the loyalty oaths that you have to take and so forth nowadays. I would never do such a thing. So I write instead, and I reach a bigger audience. I write papers. I still, from time to time, and I have clients. I do private consulting work and the like. Almost all of which want to remain absolutely anonymous.
Of course, sure.
And that's perfectly fine with me. But I also work with people in the Netherlands. They're trying to do the same thing they're doing with here as far as climate stuff goes.
Oh, sure.
With nitrogen and so forth. So we try to show where the uncertainty lies with that and so forth. So, but it's been tremendously freeing. I get more people to watch me and listen to me than I ever would if I was at a university. And I think I've changed more minds in the position that I'm in than I ever would have had a chance to do, being forced to teach in these narrow little bins, and there's no academic freedom. And even accepting the politics, there's still very little academic freedom. You're not allowed to maneuver past certain very rigorous walls that they've all set up for themselves. Everybody claims to be interdisciplinary and so forth, but they all lie. Nobody is. Sure. No, everybody has to stay in their lane, and I'm not one to do that. So it's been, overall, I didn't like it at first at all, but after I've been living with it now for a very long time, I'm exceedingly glad that I've got the life that I have. I'm very, very happy, very blessed.
I've got a strange analogy to make this question. It goes like this. One of the things which actually bizarrely now when I look back, I can see was almost like whatever religious capacity within me sort of yearning for something that was more than just science and reason and beautiful literature, etc. Was when I was in my 20s, I had a deep curiosity for the occult. And one of the things about it that was very fascinating to me was most of the people involved in it, I can tell you, and by the way, the ones who aren't are the ones you definitely want to stay away from. The ones that most of the people who say they're involved in it, it's just, it's a LARP. It's essentially, it's another way of tribal signaling. Like, this is my identity. I'm into something a bit wacky. Ooh, look at this. Haha. Like, doesn't really need to have any results. It can all just be subjective. And what I realized was, even though that particular field actually has, this is actually where a lot of the great scientists were interested in these things. It has like very deep sort of roots, and there's a lot of like mystical wisdom there. And people have tried, for example, if you actually want to do literal techniques, there are literal schools of technique where you learn for years and years and years, and you hone certain faculties and potentially have certain experiences. And what I found was most people were just tourists and they weren't really doing any of that. And what made me realize as much was when they would talk about a concept like some sort of external entity, a demon or whatever you might call it, right? Some kind of god form or something. Even when they would discuss it like either they were talking about a movie, like they were thinking of a Marvel movie with superpowers, or they thought it wasn't real, even though they said they were into it. They were talking about the theory. And the reason why I could tell was, I'll give you an example. If they would look into like a particular school of like occult theory or teaching, if they could ever find out, I often give this example to people who follow my work, if they ever found out that essentially whoever started it, there was some fraudulent element. They were either like a trickster or they invent, a classic one is you invent the roots of it and you make it seem like it goes back to Egypt as a classic one, or Babylon. Make it sound a lot older and grander than it is. And you want it to be sort of like the secret thing of like, oh, and this is secretly what the alchemists spoke of hundreds of years ago and it's come to you now. And then when they find out that's fake, they would always go, see, the whole thing's a bunk, isn't it? And I would always say, but wait, if you believe actually in like external entities that you're contacting and actually having real like experiences of communication, then it wouldn't matter what the physical reality of like who made up the story. Surely it would only matter if he had contacted the entity. It almost implies you don't believe there are entities that can be contacted. In fact, what you're looking for is a nuts and bolts sort of like paper trail that goes back to the thing, like you would in history. Again, you're not escaping rationality when you think that way. And so I say all that to say this. When you say you are someone who has a Christian impulse, obviously you're a Catholic at this point in time, and you come from, you have belief and you have things that go beyond rationality. This is a bit of a dangerous question, but I figure in light of how you answer the last one, you'll be able to give me something on it. One aspect that people is a comforting belief for a lot of people about Christianity is all the wonderful stuff. It's about Jesus and about grace and forgiveness and compassion and persistence and endurance and a loving father and a promise of an afterlife or, reward for our good behavior. But I noticed not a lot of people want to actually acknowledge any kind of even mystical reality to the dark side of it. Like, they don't really, a lot of people who say they're Christian and seem to believe in God don't actually seem to think demons could exist, or they don't think that that would even be any kind of a proxy for something or representative of something. And they certainly don't seem to acknowledge the idea that, like, if you believe that worldview, then to some degree, you are battling powers and principalities, and there is sort of a demonic or a devilish component to the world. Again, there's a million rabbit holes we could go down there. So I want to ask this to you. Do you see that in the world? Is that something you intuit? Like, for example, when people are trying to cancel you or trying to sort of put the bushel over your light, as it were, when you're trying to bring a truth to light, do you see some sort of a spiritual component behind that? Some sort of a force repressing or battling against you?
I do. Absolutely. You're quite right. Most people don't have or well-reasoned beliefs. It's all very personal, and it's all whatever is most comforting in the moment and so forth. And they don't, like you say, if they hold with Christianity, then they must hold, well, there must be demonic element to life, and to some extent, and they don't reason that out. But I think it is absolutely true that there is. I think that it's not. You have to escape the sort of Hollywoodification of the whole idea. That part's difficult. So that basis that people come to it, it's not like you're being chased around by that level of spiritual entities looking to do you physical harm and so forth. If that was the case, everybody would be dead.
Sure, of course,
soon.
yes.
So it's not that. It's not that at all. So absolutely. I mean, there's only. So I don't know quite best how to answer it. I do think that this element is absolutely real. It's always a struggle to know what's going on in a particular situation.
Yes.
I mean, you can never know with certainty unless you receive some kind of revealed truth, which is exceedingly rare. But yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there can only be. I think that what people are doing to their bodies now, cutting themselves up and everything, and in an effort to become what they can never be, has a certain definite demonic influence to it, and I think that's an inescapable belief. I mean, but it's also exacerbated by all these experts who come and say, "Well, yes, you really can be something that you're not. Science has said so, and if you just follow these procedures and write us a check for whatever it is the amount, we'll be happy to help you along this path." So there's different types. There's the false beliefs that people had that are probably demonically influenced and thinking they can become what they can't. And then there's also the greed and the arrogance and the hubris of these experts and scientists and doctors and everything who feed the delusions for their own benefit. So that's that dishonesty there. So yes, absolutely.
Yes. Along these lines then, I'll pick up on that. One of my last questions to you would be, as someone coming from a stats-based background, lots of data, is I feel like there's another area where it's clear to me that these people, the powers that be, are tapping into the religious impulse, because they have absolutely made the average person think that science, you can derive morality from science, whereas to me, there's not even a connection. It's like I said earlier about the idea that the number tells me which player is better. The number can never do that. It could maybe make me curious about why is this number bigger, but I'm still going to have to be the one who decides what the player's like. So what would you say to this aspect? Because I do feel like that's in line with what you're saying. One of the reasons these people are able to launder these potentially horrific worldviews and ways of living is because people just think, right, these are the smartest, most scientific people, and so what they believe must be the most moral, and so you have all these strange ideas.
Yes, a very common one is to say, here's a particular behavior. I won't even mention the behavior, but here's a particular behavior that I favor. And I've shown throughout history there's 3% of the population enjoy this behavior.
Oh, sure.
And therefore, it's natural. It's natural, and therefore we should accept it, and it's therefore moral. Well, all right. That same percentage, more or less, people are sociopaths and murderers.
Sure.
So, okay, they're always with us too. Is it therefore the case that sociopathy and murderous instincts and cannibalism and all this kind of stuff, should we adopt them as moral too? Because they're frequently found in the same proportions. So these arguments, this is just a form of the voting fallacy. And science has absolutely nothing to say on morality. It has absolutely nothing to say on what's right or wrong to do in any situation or what's best. All you can ask of science is, here's a question I have about the world. What do you think will happen if I do X?
Right.
All right. And I can give you a definite answer. I think Y is going to happen, or I think Y plus or minus this is going to happen, or you haven't given me information. I have no idea. That's all science can do. It could never tell you if X is good or Y is good or any of that kind of stuff. So that's the view of scientism, and we're saturated in scientism, very unfortunately.
For my last question, I don't like to do a specific outro. So what I'll do is I'll ask you a question. You'll give me your thoughts, and I'll just wrap it on that. So what I wanted to ask at the end is this. Normally, I don't necessarily ask, but in your case, I'm just very interested if you are working on another book or something. I will say for people who have been listening to this conversation and enjoyed it, one of the other things I find quite impressive is your output. Actually, you essentially publish almost every single day on your Substack, and they are things that are mixed in with topical things from new scientific papers, mixed with sometimes, for obviously over Easter, you wrote about Christian belief, etc. I would actually say how productive you are is very impressive too. So are you working on a new book? What kinds of things can you tease a little bit what people might be looking forward to in the future?
Yeah, I write so much because I can't shut up. That's the problem. Okay. I've always been this way. When I was, like first grade, I think it was, or second grade, I was in the back of the class. I was talking to my friend, and the teacher couldn't stand it, so she moved me away from my friend so I wouldn't talk so much. But I talked to whoever my next neighbor was.
Okay.
Talk too much. And so that wasn't any good. So she brought me up next to her desk thinking, okay, I won't talk if I'm sitting next to the authority in the room. But I ended up talking to her.
Okay.
So she had to banish me to the absolute. So yes, I am. I'm working on a book. I don't have a fixed title for it yet. I do have a title, but I don't want to reveal it yet.
Okay.
On scientism, on these ideas, on these very ideas of scientism and how it all fits in with uncertainty and all this kind of stuff. A more popular book, unlike some of the other stuff I've done, like my book Uncertainty. So, but I have just started a class on that. People are more than welcome to come, and it's on YouTube and elsewhere, and you can come and just watch that and try to get an idea of a step-by-step building up of all this kind of stuff. It won't necessarily be easy, but it'll be there for anybody who wants it.
This video and the others on my channel were supported by the people on my side channel Patreon. Do you want to choose a topic I focus on next? Maybe ask a question in my regular video AMA? Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are for Thorinquiry interviews? Do you want to take part in a never to be released, exclusively recorded 1 hour discussion between me and you, which actually you could also use for consulting or some sort of coaching if you'd like? Well, if so, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today, where in the description box there's a Patreon link.